now welcome our speaker for today. Abe Scarr, correct? Is the director of the Illinois PIRG, P-I-R-G, responsible for program and organizational development, research, and legislative advocacy. In his 2 years in the position, Abe has spent most of his time in a leadership role with the Just Democracy Illinois, a coalition that is focused on modernizing voter registration and election modernization. This spring, he led the advocacy efforts, which resulted in the automatic voter registration passing in the Illinois legislature with broad bipartisan support. Before becoming to Illinois PIRG, Abe was the director of ConPIRG, where he worked with ConPIRG students and staff on a variety of campaigns, including successful efforts to pass Election Day and online voter registration, and to pass a bill modernizing recycling in Connecticut, with moving it closer to zero waste. Yes, I like that. Abe started as a campus organizer with Mass PIRG in 2003 and spent 9 years as an organizer and organizing director with his various state PIRGs. He graduated from Haverford College, right? Haverford, excuse me, in 2002 with a degree in philosophy. And now, without further ado, Abe Scarr.
Thank you. I'm just bringing up my notes. So thanks everybody for coming out today, and thanks to the Y for having me. Again, I'm Abe Scarr. I'm the director of the Illinois Public Interest Research Group, or PIRG. Hopefully some folks are already familiar, but we are a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit advocacy organization. We're funded by citizens, so thousands of Illinois residents support our work and allow us to be a voice for the public interest. As you heard a little bit from my introduction, I have worked and we work on a variety of different issues, generally issues where we see that there is a public interest, special interest conflict, someplace where the public is on one side of the issue and there's a clear public interest, but some powerful special interest, be it the health, pharmaceutical industry or big utilities, are able to distort our democracy and get their way. That's where we step in to be a voice for the public. As you can imagine, with a mission like that, we have plenty of work to do. Right now, we've been focused, as you heard, on democratic reforms in Illinois. I'm also spending a lot of time working on energy and utilities. There's a big effort by Exelon to get a multi-billion-dollar ratepayer bailout of their nuclear plants, which we are opposing. But we have worked on democratic issues with the PIRGs for many years. We have had a presence here on campus this fall doing voter registration, and we've been doing nonpartisan youth voter registration going back to 1984. We have our organizer and one of our student leaders here who I'm very pleased to say helped over 2,000 students and community members register to vote or update their voter registration status this fall. So nice work, guys. Thanks for what you did. And yes, based on our history of working with students, we have a keen interest in making sure that voter registration is accessible, that the voting process is open to all, and so that we can increase participation, which we think is fundamental to making our democracy work and combating special interests. As you heard a little bit about my background, I spent many years working with the PIRG campus program, organizing students as a campus organizer myself and an organizing director. And for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been in a state director role, working to lead advocacy efforts on the state level, earlier with Connecticut, and for the last 2.5 years here in Illinois. And I've had the good benefit of getting to work on these issues significantly since then. You heard a little bit about my work in Connecticut, and it's been a big focus here in Illinois. So with that, just to briefly outline what I'm going to plan to go over today, I want to give some national context around voting and elections and what some people call the voting wars that have been going on in recent years. And looking back in the history of our country, kind of has been an ongoing tussle of progress and regress on who gets the right to vote and how people are able to vote. I'll provide some of that as context, and I know there's a lot of interest in that, but I'm not particularly an expert on that. I know probably more than most, but really my expertise and what I can have, I think that's unique to share is an insider's view of what's been happening here in Illinois over the last couple of years and where we're at specifically right now with the automatic voter registration legislation, which, as you heard, we were successful in passing with bipartisan support in the legislature, but unfortunately the governor vetoed in mid-August, and in the coming weeks we will be working to overturn that veto when the legislature returns in November. So again, just to start off with some national context, as I said earlier, the history of American democracy really is a history of who has the right to the franchise and who is us when we're thinking about citizenship. I imagine most folks know the basic story here. When our nation was founded, in order to have the right to vote, you had to be a white male property owner. So a rather restrictive subset of people, not really representative of all the people in our country. We saw that franchise extend to all white men, and there was a big kind of new broad democracy in the Jacksonian era, and Andrew Jackson as a president and became kind of famous with the Democratic Party. He's a big important person within the Democratic Party because that's when the franchise was extended and there was all these new people coming into our democracy after the Civil War, with these amendments after the Civil War, extending the franchise to African American men, and with Reconstruction. And then, of course, that's when we really see one of the first backlashes, as with the end of Reconstruction, the extension of Jim Crow laws in the South. In the 20th century, we get women getting the right to vote. The second Reconstruction, as some are calling it now, or the Civil Rights Movement, culminating with the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act in the mid-'60s. And as we'll see, this Voting Rights Act was a huge moment in our history and has important ramifications until today. This is the first election since the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act where voters won't actually enjoy the full protections of the Voting Rights Act, thanks to a Supreme Court case from a couple years ago. So these topics and ideas and this struggle over who has the right to vote continues to this day. Before I get to some of the current fights and what's going on with the Voting Rights Act and some of these state laws restricting voting access that we've seen in recent years, I do want to touch on an important piece of progress in the 90s, known as the Motor Voter Act, or the National Voter Registration Act, or NVRA as folks call it. For folks like myself who were not of voting age then, I turned 18 in the late 90s, we kind of take it for granted that when you go to get your driver's license, you're given the opportunity to register to vote. And also when you go to certain social service agencies to get social services, you also have the opportunity to register to vote there. That was because of the Motor Voter Act in 1993, which really was a big step forward in granting access to voter registration in many states where this has been implemented with vigor. The vast majority of people actually get registered to vote because of the opportunity to do so when they're interacting with those government agencies. Illinois had some part in that. Folks may be familiar with David Orr, who's the Cook County clerk. He has been a longtime advocate for expanding voting rights, and if you ever get to visit his office, as I've had the opportunity to do a couple times, you can see a picture of him on the wall with Bill Clinton at the signing for that law. The other, not incredibly important, but I think interesting anecdote was that REM, and with their album, I think Automatic for the People, and the old CD long boxes, was a part of that because they had a petition on those CD long boxes to send into Congress to ask them to pass the Motor Voter Act, and that was how Rock the Vote started, and a pretty cool instance of popular culture helping make progress on voting rights. I bring all of that up, and we'll return to that soon because the opportunity to register to vote at government agencies is a critical piece to the reforms we're working to pass now with automatic voter registration. Automatic voter registration is basically an extension of that state agency registration. And so that is a pretty important step in the progress towards expanding voting rights and voter registration modernization here in the United States. So an important place to take a couple minutes on is the recent Supreme Court case that undid some of the protections of the Voting Rights Act. It's known as Shelby County versus Holder, Shelby County being a county in Alabama, Holder being then Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder. And one of the key provisions of the Voting Rights Act is known as pre-clearance. And the basic idea was that in states or counties or places where there was a history of discrimination, largely, in the South through Jim Crow laws, but not only there. Parts in Arizona have been under pre-clearance because of a history of discrimination against Latino voters. In these jurisdictions where there was this history of discrimination, Congress said, if you're going to change voting laws, the way people can register, what identification they need to show to vote, the way you draw your district maps when states change legislative districts every 10 years, any of those changes, because you guys have this history of discrimination, that has to get cleared either by the Attorney General or by a federal court to make sure that there's not a discriminatory intent or effect. That was put in place in 1965. It was challenged in the courts. It survived those court challenges. It was originally only supposed to be there for 5 years because the Congress thought if we just do this for 5 years, we'll fix this. Of course, that's not what happened. And it was supported on an ongoing basis every couple years or 10 years or so. Congress would pass a law to extend those protections. And this was not controversial. It wasn't partisan. In fact, in 2006, Congress extended these laws for 25 years. And this had broad bipartisan support. So the idea that this was an anachronism, the no longer needed, didn't have a lot of political support. People still thought, yes, because of the history of racism in our country, the history of discrimination at polling places, we should continue this pre-clearance practice. And this is just one part of the Voting Rights Act. As many people may know, there's many other portions, but this is the key one for our topic today. A couple years ago, Alabama, this county in Alabama challenged and said, really, all that discrimination is a thing of the past. When Congress renewed this law, they didn't do new data or new analysis. They used data analysis going back to 1975. So really, this shouldn't apply to us anymore. This is a burden on us to have to go back to Congress to get, or the federal level to get clearance for laws that we should be able to handle on the local level. And so therefore, this is unconstitutional. And they took that challenge to the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, in my eyes and many eyes, they were successful in a 5-4 vote. The Supreme Court said, sure, this pre-clearance idea is okay. They didn't strike down the pre-clearance idea, but they struck down the portion that kind of said all these states or counties had to do it. So we were left with the pre-clearance in theory, but no states having to do it. And unfortunately, coming right out after that, there was a string of states that immediately passed laws that I think are pretty safe to say had a discriminatory effect, if not intent. So laws were passed in Alabama, Arizona, North Carolina, Ohio, Texas, and Wisconsin. It varied state by state. Some of them were redistricting plans, again, how they redrew the maps. In North Carolina, they severely limited early voting. They took away same-day registration, the ability to register to vote on Election Day. They took away pre-registration, which is a practice we don't have here, but we're hoping to pass here, where you can register when you're 16 or 17 so that as soon as you become eligible by age, it's automatic. They took that away. Wisconsin had a new voter ID law, which clearly has discriminatory intent, I would say, because you can use certain sorts of IDs, but the kind of standard student ID wouldn't work, and universities are having to give students a second ID in order just to be able to vote. A lot of these laws were quickly enacted in order to limit who is able to participate. Of course, that's not what the sponsors of these laws would say, except in some occasional unguarded moments. And unfortunately, we've seen a big step backwards in terms of people's access to the polls. It's all happening right now. It's a very interesting time. Just within the last 2 months, a lot of these laws have been overturned. Not at the Supreme Court level. As folks know, we have a vacancy on the Supreme Court right now. But I think in part because of that vacancy, and lower courts knowing that things are not going to get heard by the the Supreme Court and not get heard by the same Supreme Court that overturned this portion of the Voting Rights Act, I think a lot of lower courts are feeling a little bit more freedom to make decisions and to overturn some of these laws. So we've seen in Texas and North Carolina, Wisconsin, cases just, again, within the last couple months overturning these laws or requiring that the states do more to make voting more accessible. North Carolina, I think, really stands out. That's one where the court found discriminatory intent. They found that the legislature in North Carolina acted specifically to make it harder for African Americans to vote, and that they did so for partisan reasons. They had evidence that legislators had gotten census tract data, had looked at voting patterns, had made changes specifically based on where people were voting, how people were voting, and there was a record actually from the work they'd done in passing that legislation that showed that they had discriminatory intent. So, pretty significant finding there, and of course, who knows when we'll have another Supreme Court justice, but I think there's a good chance that the makeup of the Supreme Court will change, and again, there will be a movement, hopefully, to expand voting rights in the coming years. Unfortunately, many of this push and pull and these advances and setbacks in recent years has a pretty partisan tone to it. In many states, Democrats are the ones pushing to expand voting laws. Republicans are the ones working to retract voting laws. And, the conventional wisdom is that that's based on a partisan analysis and a partisan idea about who's voting and who it benefits. One of the things I think is beneficial, and what I will talk about here in a moment, is that in large part, we've been able to start moving past that here in Illinois and in other states, especially with automatic voter registration. It is a reform that is gaining bipartisan support across the country. And as a nonpartisan organization and somebody who advances voting laws and makes voting easier, not in order to get any one person or party elected, but because we think it's important to the well-functioning democracy, that's a good thing that we're hopefully starting to move out of this partisan back and forth on voting into some bipartisan consensus about modernizing our election systems. I don't hold out any, I don't have any illusions that that's going to happen just like this and that the partisan fighting over this will continue, but I do think there are reasons for hope that we are starting to, or in at least some places starting to move past that. So that's some of the national context, and I imagine for some in the audience that may be stuff you already knew, but it is important context to what has been going on in Illinois. I want to, again, get to what's going on right now with automatic voter registration, but even just to back up and give a little bit more context, there's actually been a lot of changes to election law in Illinois over the last 2 or 3 years. The coalition, which was mentioned in my introduction, Just Democracy Illinois, which is a coalition of about 16 organizations now representing a wide variety of issues, kind of traditional good government or reform organizations like mine, civil rights organizations like the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and faith organizations. A variety of organizations have come together in recent years to try to make progress on democracy issues in general, but so far we've been focused on election law. So our first success came with online voter registration a couple years ago. So now anyone can, if you have a driver's license or state ID that they can match up with their system, you can go online and get registered to vote. Obviously that has a great impact in particular for younger voters who think, as they should, that you should be able to do something like that online. I think, I don't have my numbers with this, but Arizona was the first state to do this maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and now it's something like 15 to 20 states have adopted online voter registration. It's a really simple reform, makes it much more accessible to voters, and saves the state a lot of money, because if you get an online form. You already have the data digitally. You don't have to process paperwork. It's much more efficient. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do with these reforms is actually increase efficiency and make things not only easier for the voter, but for the state government who administers all this. 2 years ago now, in the veto session of 2014, so if folks aren't familiar with how the Illinois legislature works, they're generally in session from January through the end of May, and we'll usually come back in November for a couple weeks to consider overturning vetoes that the governor may have issued after the legislative session. Legislature doing whatever it wants. Also, they'll do lots of other things besides just overturning vetoes. And one of the things that they did in the veto session and we helped advocate for was a pretty sweeping reform bill for voter registration and election modernization. The flagship policy was Election Day registration. That's an important safeguard, we think. We don't think it's how people should get registered to vote. It's much better if people are registered or have their address updated with their registration before Election Day. But in the instance that there's a mistake or a problem, sometimes people are knocked off the rolls when they shouldn't because maybe they only vote in presidential elections and it's been 4 years and some administrator thought they should no longer be on the rolls there. It's a way for somebody to correct that and still be able to participate on Election Day. There were other reforms that were part of that package. One that I'm particularly happy about and has an impact here is that all public four-year universities across Illinois are now required to have at least 3 days of early voting on campus before any election. So the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday before the Tuesday election day at the student union at all public four-year universities across the state now have to have an early voting location. I understand that we have an early voting location on campus now, which is great. They're even going above and beyond here on campus. But by law, every four-year university has to do that in those 3 days. We also joined ERIC, which I won't go into too much, but ERIC is a multi-state data sharing collaboration where if somebody moves out of state and if I, let's say, moved back home to Kentucky and registered to vote there but didn't cancel out my registration here, and if Kentucky and Illinois were both in ERIC, they would trade data occasionally and be able to see, oh, Abe has moved to Kentucky and registered there, we can cancel his registration in Illinois. Because voter registration and election administration is handled on the state level, except with states who've opted into this program, ERIC, that type of data sharing isn't happening. So there are a number of those reforms. I'll say briefly, there has been a little tussle over the Election Day registration law. As folks may be aware, coming into this election, a conservative think tank sued I think in August as well, claiming that it was unconstitutional because the way the law was written with Election Day registration, in counties of 100,000 people or more, they have to provide Election Day registration opportunities in every precinct. But in counties that are smaller and that don't have electronic poll books, which is just a way of making your voting lists electronic, they can opt not to do it in every precinct and every polling place, but have a centralized location. That's not what we wanted. We wanted it to be in every precinct all across the state, but a number of the smaller county officials who run elections objected, and as a compromise, when we passed the law a couple years ago, we said, okay, in these smaller counties, if you don't have the tools, it's okay to just provide it in a centralized location. So this organization sued, saying that that was discriminatory. It gave people in the larger counties better access to the polls, and that was intended to help elect Democrats. And they sued on that basis. They actually were able to convince a federal judge that their case had merit, and for a short period of time, election officials were not going to be allowed to provide Election Day registration in precinct anywhere in the state. But then an appeals court thankfully said that that was not an appropriate response and has stopped that order by the courts, and that court case will continue after the election. We're pretty confident. We've filed an amicus brief as that. We're pretty confident we'll come out successful. But these tussles do continue even here in Illinois. So I want to then get to the automatic voter registration campaign and where that's at, and then I'll try to wrap up so we can have plenty of time for question and answer. So automatic voter registration is a relatively new idea here in the United States, and it is an important piece to move towards what I think should be our goal, which is universal voter registration, which is every eligible citizen is registered to vote and their information is kept up to date, and the responsibility of doing that is on the government for maintaining that list. Whereas now we have this kind of weird system, which is not like any other modern democracy in the world, where it's kind of up to the individual and up to nonprofit groups like ours to perform this government function of going out and getting people onto the list. It kind of seems like the way it should work to us because that's what most of us have grown up with, but in almost any other modern democracy, they do have universal registration. If you're a citizen, if you're of age, the government, you'll tend to interact with them. They'll have information about who you are, what your address is, your date of birth, and they can just compile that into a voting list. And that's ultimately the goal where we're trying to get here in the United States, and this is an important step towards doing that. Oregon became the first state to pass an automatic voter registration law in the spring of 2015. Their Secretary of State had been championing it and became governor, and she managed to help make it get through. California was soon after them, passing a slightly different type of automatic voter registration. And since those two states passed a law in the spring of 2015, several states have followed their lead. So West Virginia has passed an automatic voter registration law. Vermont has passed an automatic voter registration law. And in the state where I used to work, Connecticut, they didn't do it through a law, but the Secretary of State determined that she had the authority through existing law to implement it and make Connecticut have automatic voter registration. And something like 20 states have introduced legislation and are in various stages of doing it. We've come close here, as you've heard. Alaska may be doing it very soon. So there's definitely a movement across the country and increasingly bipartisan movement. West Virginia is not a state that run by Democrats. It passed almost unanimously there. It passed with broad bipartisan support in Vermont. Which maybe doesn't count, at least to some people. In Washington State, there's a Republican Secretary of State who's championing the law. So it is a reform that not only here in Illinois, but across the country really it has increasing bipartisan consensus. So the basics of the policy is going back to what I was saying earlier about motor voter and state agency registration, is to take that process where now you have the opportunity to register to vote, and you have to opt in and say, yes, I want to register to vote, to change that around. So instead of having the opportunity to say, yes, I want to register you unless you say, no, I don't want to be registered. That's the basics there. And again, going to the idea of universal voter registration, the idea is to say, if you're eligible to vote, if you're a citizen, if you're 18, or in some cases here in Illinois, actually you can vote in primaries when you're 17. If you're eligible, you shouldn't have to take any affirmative action. You don't have to go out of your way to exercise what is a fundamental right. If you interact with government in any way, if they have your information, they should use that to make sure your voter registration is accurate and up to date. And that's all we're doing here. The mechanism we're using is this agency registration, as this is the one place where state government already performs this function, again, at the DMV when you're getting your driver's license or at social service agencies, and to use that interaction and to switch it from being an opt-in process to an opt-out process. There's a lot of reasons why this makes a lot of sense. One of the things we stressed a lot in our campaign is that this will make our voting lists more accurate and secure. And this was a big motivation for Republicans to vote in terms of concerns about the security of our elections. Pew, a nationally respected think tank, has estimated that 1 out of 8 voter registrations in the United States is either inaccurate or out of date. That's not because anybody's perpetrating a fraud or doing anything irregular. It's just because people move, people die, and they don't always update their voter registration. You may move within a county or move from county to county or election jurisdiction to election jurisdiction, and most people don't know that when you do that, you need to update your voter registration, and the onus is on you to update your registration. And so they don't, and that's what leads to about 12% of our voting list being inaccurate. And when I've spoken to elections officials, I've spoken to Gordy Holton, who's the county clerk here in Champaign, or David Orr's office in Cook County. they verify that this national statistic is basically right. There's this dead wood on their list, and they want very much to get that off. And by automatically taking the data for when people update their registration, update their driver's license or interact with a social service agency, that should cut that out incredibly. And again, we know that voter impersonation fraud is not a real thing, despite some attempt to say that, oh, we have this big problem with people trying to pretend they're somebody else and go vote. That is not a real thing. To the extent there are any irregularities in voting and people do try to game the system, it's usually very local level on very local races where a couple votes will matter, and it's often with things like absentee ballots and where somebody may knew somebody moved but try to get their ballot for them. Again, very rare, but to the extent it happens, this type of reform actually solves a problem and actually makes our voting lists more secure versus a photo ID law, which doesn't actually protect our elections in any way and makes it harder for many people to actually vote. So that was one of the cases we made, that if you care about the accuracy of our lists, if you care about making sure our elections are more secure, this is a great reform. This is something you should get behind. It will also make our voting system much more efficient. So again, well, I'll tell a story of when I moved back to Illinois. I'd lived here before, but I was in Connecticut for a little while, moved back a couple years ago, and went to get my Illinois driver's license, and I knew I was doing that pretty early when I moved here, so I knew that was going to be the way that I could register to vote. And they asked me if I wanted to register. I said yes. I had to check a couple boxes affirming that I was a citizen and that I was 18 years old, even though I had already documented to them by showing my passport that I was a citizen, and even though they already had my birth date, I still had to take these steps and provide a second signature, even though I had already given them my signature for my driver's license. And then they had all the information they needed to register me to vote in their computer. The signature was collected on a touchpad. It was all electronic. But instead of then sending it to the Chicago Board of Elections, my election authority, they printed out the paper on a paper form so they could send it to the Chicago Board of Elections, where then somebody was paid to re-enter that information into a computer. And that's been how it's been happening for many years in many locations. Obviously, that's inefficient. Obviously, that takes a lot of money when we could just send that information electronically. That also increases the likelihood there'll be mistakes. When somebody has to process a form, they are prone to make a typing error. So this is actually part of this. The electronic transfer of records was something we also included in the law we passed 2 years ago. So even without automatic voter registration, we are starting to get that streamlining. That was supposed to be implemented by this summer, but you may have heard we have a budget problem here in the state, and so that hasn't been fully implemented yet. But regardless of whether we pass automatic voter registration, we should be sending those files electronically. But then with automatic voter registration, if we're just getting many more people registered that way, that means many more files coming in electronically versus the 2,000 plus that we and other people registered here in the community. Those are all still paper forms that people are filling out and that Gordy Holton and his staff have to enter. And often, I think it was your experience that we were out trying to register people for weeks and weeks, but we got maybe doubled our total, got 1,000 of those just in the last week because people are like, oh, I guess I should actually do this now. And so Gordy and his staff have to hire, often, I don't know exactly here, but many election jurisdictions have to hire on additional staff or have people do lots of overtime to process all those forms at the end of the day. All of these things cost a lot of money. And so to the extent we can make it more electronic, to the extent we can even out registration so people are getting registered all the time or updating their registration all the time and less of a rush to get registered at deadlines, that will make this much more efficient. So that was another case we made to legislators. And finally, obviously something that's important to me and many other people, if not the case we would always make to legislators, was this would expand the franchise. This would mean many more eligible voters would have the opportunity to get registered to vote. There's been different estimations of what the impact of this would be. The best estimate that I've seen is that this would add about 1.13 million eligible Illinois voters to the rolls. That's pretty significant. And just getting them registered does not guarantee that they will go out and vote, but it will make it much more likely that they will. Once you're a registered voter, you will get on lists. You'll get on a campaigns list. So campaigns will see you as a registered voter, and they'll want to come knock on your door or send you mail. You'll be encouraged to vote. Groups like ours, who care about just increasing participation, can get access to that list instead of just building it ourselves by going out and registering people or having people pledge to vote. And we can identify younger voters because that's what we care about, and we can go out and encourage them to vote. So just by getting more people on the list, that should increase voter participation. Illinois lags the region, lags the nation in voter participation. We are one of the worst in youth voter participation. So there's a real case to be made that reforms like this are important for the health of our democracy. I want to wrap up here pretty quickly, but just there are a couple concerns in terms of implementing and making sure automatic voter registration works well, which I can get to if folks are interested more in implementation, things like making sure only eligible citizens are registered. Non-citizens can get a driver's license here in Illinois, so we need to make sure that we're not accidentally registering them, both for the integrity of our elections and because that can lead to them getting deported or losing their ability to gain citizenship, and we don't want to do that. There are privacy concerns if folks are perhaps a victim of domestic violence or a survivor of domestic violence and want to make sure that their address does not become public for a past abuser. They don't want their information, because they go and get a driver's license, to become available then on a publicly available voting list. So there are concerns that we've had to work through in the legislation, in which we did work through. And again, I will be happy to talk about more if folks are interested, that we address with the legislation. All the past reforms I talked about earlier, the online voter registration, election day registration, they passed on partisan votes, Democrats supporting them, Republicans not. It was important to us not only because we had a Republican governor, but because in general we want to make these bipartisan reforms. I did work with Gordy Holton here, who was this past year the president of the Association of County Clerks in the state, to get input and to make this a bipartisan reform. At the end of the day, we were able to pass the bill in both chambers with broad bipartisan support. 86 voters in the House, that means 15 Republicans voted for it. I'm a little rough on my numbers here. I think we had something like 41 in the Senate. We had a number of Republicans in the Senate. More Republicans in the Senate voted for it than voted against it, including the minority leader in the Senate. So we were very successful, and it's an achievement I'm quite proud of, that we were able to do that on the very last day of session. I think session ended around midnight on May 31st, and we passed the second chamber at 11 p.m. Unfortunately, Governor Rauner vetoed it on August 12th, the last day he had to take action on it. We had entered into negotiations with him in the weeks preceding to it and with his office. They have claimed publicly and to us privately that they support the law in concept, but they had some problems with pieces of the law. Unfortunately, they didn't raise those during the legislative process. We met with his office during the legislative process. We took feedback from Senate Republicans. We made changes to the law to meet their needs. We got feedback from Gordy and the clerks, and we made changes to meet their needs. The governor's office didn't raise any of these concerns during the legislative process when we could have addressed them, but they did raise them afterwards. Many of the changes we were actually okay with and we would have made, but there were a couple that we weren't okay with and we didn't agree to. Those included pushing back the implementation date a year and a pretty fundamental change to the way it would be administered that we thought would lead to many less people getting registered. And so while we agreed to, I think, 5 out of 7 of their requests in negotiations, we did not agree to those final 2, and he vetoed it. And so now we're going into legislative session. We'll pick up 1 week after Election Day. There are scheduled 3 days that week, and then there's a week off for Thanksgiving, and then 3 days scheduled the week after Thanksgiving. We're pretty confident we'll be able to overturn the veto in the Senate, where there's both a larger Democratic majority and Republicans who we were pretty confident will vote for it. The House is trickier. The Democrats have a supermajority technically in the House, but there's both a problem potentially of attendance. Not everybody will show up every day during veto session, and then immediately you don't necessarily have the votes to do it with just Democrats. And then one Democrat in particular, Ken Duncan from Chicago, has broken with his party very publicly on a number of occasions. And so we think in order to overturn it, we're going to need Republican votes, and we're happy to fight for those votes as we did the first time around and got 15 of them. As folks may be paying attention to the elections here, Governor Rauner is pouring a ton of money into state house races. He is, I think, estimates up to $50 million by the end of the election cycle. So I think a lot of it will come down to how the elections turn out, and if that's successful for the Republicans and they pick up seats and people see that they don't want to break with the governor, I think it'll be pretty hard to overturn the veto in the House. If they don't end up picking up that many seats, and some House members may think, really, I don't know if I want to throw in my lot with the governor, maybe it is a better vote for me long term to stick to my previous vote. So we think we do have an opportunity, and we're working in those Republican districts, one of which is around here, not in Carol Ammon's district, but in the other House district. Chad Hayes was one of the people who voted for it. We're working to build that support. And finally, before I wrap up, I would be remiss not to mention that Representative Ammons was one of the lead co-sponsors of this legislation, worked closely with her office. She's been a good champion on this issue, and we'll certainly be continuing to work with her when we go back into the veto session. And with that, I'll wrap up and make sure we have time for questions.
We only have one mic, so if you have a question, can you come up towards the front of the room so we can get a better audio on you? That's detail. Rauner could have done an amendatory veto instead of holding it to the very end of the session, right?
Yep.
But what I wanted to ask you about is the co-funded Kansas project, which generated Crosscheck, which is the other, besides Eric, attempt to prevent interstate voting, or double voting and impersonation, et cetera. Kurt Kobach, the Secretary of State of Kansas, has this list. It's got 7 million people on it. It may disqualify hundreds of thousands of people across the country. And they don't even check for the middle name. It's ridiculous. The best source on this is Greg Pallas, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, which is a book, a film, and a comic book, and a webzine. So.
Great. And I'll just reiterate, paraphrase the question a little bit so we make sure we can pick it up. But the question was about a Koch brothers funded effort, best personified by the Secretary of State of Kansas, who is a anti-voting rights crusader, to use data not to enable more people to vote, but to knock people off the ballot. I honestly am not an expert on this, but I would just, a couple of things I would say is that we live in a big data era. We have incredible new opportunities because of digital information and our ability to use data to make many things in our lives better. There are obviously risks with that as well. And to the extent we're using data and using data matching from across the country, we need to be very careful to do that. And the assumption should be that people have the right to vote. We should be using data to enable more people to vote, not to make it harder for people to vote. And we need lots of matching. So just a first name and a last name is not nearly enough information to affirm that this is the same person for a voting list. Obviously, many people have the same name, so we need other things like date of birth, their social security number if they use that, driver's license number if they use that, addresses. There's, we can get like a 5-point or a 6-point match of data to, confirm before we knock somebody off a list, not doing it off of just a couple pieces of information. And yes, the voting wars continue. Again, my job is to try to downplay that at some point, because I think ultimately we do need to make this bipartisan. And so while that is a real threat and there are actors out there working to make voting harder, I'm working to build the coalition of folks on both parties who are committed to expanding and modernizing voting and elections here in Illinois and across the country. So other questions? Yeah.
So I'm curious, so even if the bill, like you were successful in the veto session, and you do get this current kind of automatic bill passed, what does the next step look like? What's kind of the next policy that's on your radar?
Yeah, so the question was, if automatic voter registration passes, what's the next step or next policy on our radar? A couple things. One is just passing a law is not enough. You need to implement it well. And especially with a policy like this, which I noted some of the concerns about from the immigration community, who's part of our coalition, about accidentally registering non-citizens, which I don't think will happen under our system. We've built in important checks to make sure that doesn't happen. But in order for these things to be done right, we have to implement it well. So one thing we wrote into the law was we would empower the State Board of Elections, which is the statewide voting authority. In many states, it's the Secretary of State, not here in Illinois. We wrote into the law that they would have to have public hearings so that we would have a formal opportunity to weigh in with them and have the public weigh in with them to actually implement the law the way we wanted. The online voter registration, we learned they did not implement the law the way we wanted there. It's been clunky and not as efficient and as good system as we think they could have built. So I think that's an important next step. In terms of policy, I mean, on the broader democratic reform agenda, there's a bunch of things, and on top on my agenda would be money and politics, which I think we have a limited window to address on this, at least at the state level here in Illinois. But I think there are opportunities there. There's been a big fight over redistricting here and redistricting reform. That certainly would be on our agenda as well. Just in the terms of voter registration and voter modernization, you know, if we're successful here, which if not this November, I'm confident we will be in the next year or two, we'll have done an incredible amount in terms of online voter registration, same-day voter registration, and automatic voter registration. Those are really the pillars of a modern voting system. Some of the things that would still be on our list is pre-registration. So that was, we included it originally in this bill. We left it out as we got into negotiations. But so that, especially tied with automatic voter registration, if you can imagine all the 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds who go in to get a driver's license or state ID, if we could capture that information then and get them on a, a pre-cleared list. Again, they wouldn't be able to vote when they're 16, but we'd have all their information on the voting list ready to become active the day they become eligible by age. That would be an important reform. I know Gordy Holton here is interested in vote centers, which is less of a voter registration reform, but an election day reform. Basically, right now, you can, if you go to an early voting center, it's a universal site, so you can, if you go to the Union to vote, if you live anywhere in Champaign County, you can vote there. It doesn't have to be within your precinct. We have that on early voting days, but we don't have that on election day. And the idea with voting centers is to move away from the in-precinct polling location where only people in that area can vote to less but centralized locations where anybody from within a jurisdiction can vote. There's a lot of good things about that, especially if you can make sure that all those sites are accessible. You have less staff, so you can have, and volunteers who are working on election day, so you can make sure they're properly trained. You can make the whole thing more efficient. Obviously, where those voting centers are located becomes a concern. Because you can imagine in a campus community like this where they could not have a vote center on campus. And that would be a big problem for the student population, or in other counties where perhaps there's a minority population, there's not a vote center there. So there's important things, safeguards that we'd have to put into place. But that would be one. You know, a lot of states are doing vote by mail. So there's a number of things that get more into the election administration and how election day runs. I think, again, we will have accomplished a significant amount. And I imagine with our coalition, we would stay engaged with some of these issues, but also try to maybe start focusing on other issues like money and politics, which unfortunately I think we'll have to take some time to be successful on, but we're ready for the fight. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm not sure what my question is, but you talked about modernizing voting systems.
Mm-hmm.
Does that relate to like the day you vote, electronic voting? I have a lot of concerns about electronic voting.
Yes.
Without a paper trail.
Yep.
Which I believe exists in some places.
Yes.
So have you done any work in that area?
Sure. So the question is, I've talked about modernizing not only voter registration, but elections, and expressing concern over electronic voting systems which don't leave a paper trail. So when I've been referring to modernizing elections, it's been more along the lines of like election day registration, vote centers, if done right, not on the voting machinery per se. There's certainly a lot to do with voting machinery, and yes, there is a concern. After the 2000 election and the debacle in Florida, Congress passed the Help America Vote Act, which led to put a lot of money into states modernizing their voting systems and moving away from some of the older systems to more electronic systems. But we saw within those that those had their own problems and have the potential to be hacked. There's not much has happened in this regard, and there was a lot of concern, I know, in the 2004 election. And I guess part of my message would be that people should not be too worried about that. I think there's a danger in being too worried about this and depressing people's participation. So I would want to, part of my message in terms of if there's concerns here is that, by and large, our voting systems are just fine. There's been obviously some hacks in voting lists this year, but people should have very much confidence in the election systems. The vote is not rigged. You should go vote with confidence. There does need to be, in some places, I think it is important that there's a paper trail, that the way we manage our elections are done professionally. There is some interest now in online voting, and in some jurisdictions there is some limited online voting happening, in particular for military personnel who are serving overseas. I'm not an expert on this, but from my work here in the state and hanging out with election officials a lot, I know there is big concerns with them. They don't think it's a good idea, largely because it's, as I understand it, there's a challenge with having two important principles in play. One is security, and that it can't be hacked, and the person voting is the person voting, and it's their vote. And second is anonymity, the secrecy of the ballot box, and that with online voting, you can't have both at the same time, and so therefore it's a problem. I know other folks, there's actually a Republican state representative here in Illinois who's actually big gung-ho, and he's a physicist and statistician and thinks there's a way to do it. I don't think we'll be pursuing that anytime soon here in Illinois. Yes?
What are your thoughts on the redistricting maps here in Illinois?
Yes. So the question was, what's my thought on the redistricting maps here in Illinois? We were a supporter of the independent maps proposal. Folks may be familiar that there was a ballot initiative effort this fall that collected over 500,000 signatures to place a redistricting reform effort on the ballot. It was thrown out by the Supreme Court. Illinois' Constitution has an incredibly narrow window for citizens to be able to take democracy into their own hands, direct democracy, and vote on things. And the Supreme Court ruled it was not an allowable amendment, and so voters will not have the chance to weigh in on this fall. The current way we draw maps here in Illinois, legislative maps here in Illinois, in many parts of the country, is a highly partisan affair. One party ends up controlling the process and will draw the maps to the benefit of their party. This has happened for many years, but it's kind of gone on steroids in recent years because, again, we live in an era of big data, and the map drawers now have an incredible amount of data, whether it's voting history, whether it's census data, whether it's commercial data of what magazine subscriptions people have. They can put these into powerful computer programs and with much more precision than they were able to before, draw maps to benefit their party or to benefit incumbents in general. One reform that has taken place in states such as California and Arizona is to take the drawing of legislative district maps out of the hands of politicians and give it to a nonpartisan commission. And there's been great success, in particular in California, in doing this. On the opposite side, some people think it's good that politicians are doing it because people can hold politicians accountable, and there's some democratic accountability in that sense. I don't buy that argument, and I think that the results here in Illinois, as in many states, and you look at Congress, are evidence that our current system is broken. So we support that reform. At the same time, I think you have to be careful to put too much in that. If we get nonpartisan maps and independent maps drawn here, it's not going to solve all of our problems. And sometimes supporters, again, which we are one, but sometimes supporters, I think, overpromise in terms of the impact it will have. There are other reforms we can have, such as multi-member districts, which Illinois had in the past, or ranked choice voting or other voting systems. There are other ways that we can hold our elections that give people more choice and can allow minority populations better chances to elect candidates of their choosing. It's not all about how the maps are drawn. And so I think there will be ongoing efforts to reform the map-making process, but I think we should also, as reformers, look at other systems and other solutions to get what we want, which is accountable government and representative government.